Great. So let's jump right into it because there's a lot to talk about. So last Sunday was the first round of the presidential elections. I believe Lula da Silva uh, was leading by at least 5 million votes, if I remember correctly, which is a higher, and then he had like around 48, 49% of the total vote tally, which was more than he's gotten in in previous presidential elections. But let's start with Pedro, and maybe just a quick reflection on Sunday night's results and what they mean for the upcoming second round at the end of this month.
Sure. Well, so first of all, like nobody expected this would be an easy election to win. We were all very confident. We believe we're gonna win. Statistics are on our side, and the campaign as well, and of course the general feeling of the Brazilian people that this has to be done. They really want to get over Bolsonaro. So when we see the results, of course, there's a shock. People were waiting to win on first turn. There was this high expectations. Militants, people on the streets, they believed that could happen, and polls were pointing into that direction. However, there is something those polls did not catch, which is the silent vote to Bolsonaro, and those who are more anti-PT than they are anti-Bolsonaro, and they were showing up on polls supporting Ciro Gomes and Simone Tebet, the other candidates on the fourth and third position, respectively. And in the end, we believe some of those votes migrated directly to Bolsonaro. They knew the third way was not possible, it wouldn't go to the second turn, so they decided to make their votes more useful, voting directly to Bolsonaro already. So expectations are that those who voted for Simone Tebet and Ciro Gomes in the end will now migrate to Lula, and we can win some other indecisive votes and win over abstention as well a little bit.
Yeah, I think that there was a rather quixotic hope and expectation, not just in Brazil among the militants working on this campaign, but perhaps even more strongly and even more delusionally at the international level, that Brazil was going to buck the trend that we see across Latin America and around the world and go for this full-scale expulsion or eviction of not just the figure of Bolsonaro, but Bolsonarismo and the extreme right. There was a hope, an almost savior-like adulation of the figure of Lula, that this election was going to, finally bring sanity back to our democracies, bolster its institutions, and get some of these crazies, some of these deplorables, to borrow a word that I think actually does translate well across political cultures for the way in which some of the more kind of self-respecting, I'm putting that in air quotes, factions of Brazil's political classes looked at these extreme right radicals. And lo and behold, just like in the United States and elsewhere, we're not seeing the whole-scale eviction of these characters. Pedro mentioned some of the strategic voting that led to Bolsonaro overperforming in his own rival to 43 and pico percent in this election. But it's critical to emphasize that down ballot, you saw a lot of these really wild characters, people like Damaris Alves, the former minister for women, who thinks that the church should be governing the state, that boys should wear blue, girls should wear girls, and abortion should be illegal and under all circumstances, including rape. Sergio Moro, former Bolsonaro ally, now having declared his support for Bolsonaro in the second round, who was the architect of the Lava Jato prosecution that put Lula in prison on false charges of corruption, and many other desultory figures, kind of cretinous figures from the Bolsonaro right. And I think time and again we're realizing, in Brazil as elsewhere, that it's not going to be as easy as waking up from a nightmare, that the hard work of fighting the far right, which is a fundamentally political and economic question of providing for people's needs, bolstering faith and confidence in what the state can provide. It's not just a question about, humiliating them in public and dunking on their tweets, nor is it about calling in the gringos to say we're scared about the fate of democracy. It's going to have to be handled by the Lula government that we are confident will come to power in January, with a program that begins to really take care of people and build back their confidence in a social and democratic state that really responds to their core needs.
Yeah, if I can just add into that, Nick, it's true that some of these Bolsonaristic figures were elected. Former ministers, Bolsonaro, the most lunatic ones, are there now in Senate and in the chamber. In the chamber, the fourth most voted deputy, federal deputy from São Paulo, was Ricardo Salles, the guy responsible to rape off the Amazon and all the environmental policies. But it's also true that some of them lost and were not elected in this election. So it shows that even Bolsonarism is trying to realign, is trying to remake their strategy, and that the left, and in this case, in many states led by PSOL, is positioning itself in a good place that is winning over those people. So in São Paulo, Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who had a recording vote in the last election of over 1 million votes, felt down to the second position, to the third position actually, with way fewer votes, and in first place was elected Guilherme Boulos, the homeless workers movement leader, who is PSOL candidate from the municipality of São Paulo in the last election and was our presidential candidate into the 2018 election with over 1 million votes. So it's true that some of these figures will be there, and in the Senate is horrible. They will be there for 8 years. This is a long fight we are entering, but we had some very good wins as well in the legislative.
Talk about, I guess the last time the three of us were actually in a room together was last year, and we sat around and we met and discussed and dialogued with a lot of the kind of progressive forces of the left, the various social movements. We talked with the MST, the MTST, PSOL, PT, the Workers' Party, Lula's party. But one thing that was really that really stuck out to my mind is that Bolsonaro isn't just some kind of lunatic, who's out there just saying wild things. He's actually backed by a certain, interests in big capital. And Pedro, can you describe those kind of industries that are backing him and why they have a vested interest in the outcome of this particular election?
Interesting if you look into the voting map and you see, Nick, the places we were talking all the time when you were here in Brazil, can you hear me now? Okay. So the places we were talking all the time in the Brazilian map where the agribusiness is expanding and taking off the Cerrado and the Amazon right in the middle east of the country and going up north. If you look into the voting map, those are areas that totally voted for Bolsonaro. So it's not by chance that these key places in Brazil for this brutal agribusiness industry that is destroying the Amazon and exporting soy to Europe and China and the US, all those places, they are mining indigenous land, they are cutting the forest in the middle. They are controlled by very powerful groups. Of course, the southeast of Brazil, where you have industrial power, the financial power, those who have actually the 1% in Brazil, some of these people are still with Bolsonaro. What is happening now is that even the economic power is also realigning. Agribusiness has split already. Not all agribusiness is supporting Bolsonaro because his environmental policy was so horrible and devastating that international community started looking into it, and threats of boycotts and legislations, even the free trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union was put into question because of all these predatory actions against the environment, against indigenous people, against quilombolas. So there's part of the agribusiness and part of the industrial world. There is also worry that even if Bolsonaro was benefiting them somehow, it wouldn't be the best strategy. Others already understood that economically it makes no sense because our economy is not going well. And it's true that no matter how much they try to feel into the anti-PT sentiment, those people made more money in the Lula government than they're making with Bolsonaro. Economy was going better. People had money to circulate the economy. Internationally, Brazil was better placed. We had dollar reserves. We paid our debts. We were at some point between the biggest economies in the world. So even the economic class is now realizing that Bolsonaro is not a good path. And there's a second argument, and I'll finish with that, is that they're realizing that even if they want to get away from PT, Bolsonaro is a threat to democracy. So some of these people are understanding that if they want to present a third way, if they want to replace PT and Bolsonaro, it might be the case to win with Lula now to preserve democracy and then try to get into power. So there's a movement going around this, and we hope that some of these people will support Lula, even if before they were silent about it.
Yeah, a few reflections. I think it's been really fascinating in the past few months to see these deep divisions in the Brazilian bourgeoisie that are not like affective, but are very clearly about the architecture of Brazil's national and international political economy. Agribusiness, which was hugely supported by this government, in terms of the way it restructured the economy, whereas other kind of industrialists, depending on more international finance, who are much less interested in defending the political economic project of Bolsonarismo. So you can see these really interesting fractures and fragmentation as some people jump ship. Certainly, capital was well aligned behind Bolsonaro in 2018. Now many of them are jumping ship and coming on to support Lula. But that said, I think it is fascinating to look at this map and look at the ways in which even the most elite interests are fragmenting. Brazil remains a fundamentally Brazil's political system remains a fundamentally class-oriented system, right? You can see a clear linear relationship between class and Bolsonaro voting, or Lula to Bolsonaro voting, right? So Brazil's poorest classes across the country are voting for PT, are voting for the program that Lula is putting forward, Lula and this coalition project are putting forward, which is effectively the most urgent social crises. Homelessness, hunger, and health are really the top priorities in addressing the disaster that is Bolsonarismo, and people who are wealthy are overwhelmingly supportive of Bolsonaro. These are the people who, ride their loud motorcycles to the streets of Rio de Janeiro to go to the 7th of September rally to, yell racist slurs and call for the slaughter of indigenous people to, steal the resources underneath their feet. So I think that this is a very class-aligned country in ways that to many listeners in the so-called global North or in the United States may be used to like education polarization, and it's really not where we're at here in Brazil. I do think that there's something worth considering, and here maybe I depart from Pedro, who I think is making a very effective pitch for what this for where the country needs to go, which is I think that. I worry that there is a tendency to confusion, a local tendency for international tendency. So, for example, let's take inflation, right? The world is going through an inflationary wave. And I think there's a tendency to see that general inflationary wave through a domestic lens to say, oh, it's Petro's fault that there's inflation in Colombia. It's Boric's fault there's inflation in Chile. Or it's Bolsonaro's fault there's inflation in Brazil. I think that what's really interesting about Bolsonarismo is that because of the pandemic and because of his absence of leadership and effective management of this country, like the economy was destroyed, and the claims of genocide, the legal case against Bolsonaro for his criminal handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has advanced as well, right? And all these social issues became social crises under his leadership. But I worry there's a tendency to read that history backwards as opposed to forwards. If the pandemic didn't happen, would Bolsonarismo have been such an unstable mode of political economy that some of these bourgeois interests would have jumped shipped? Would it have been possible for Bolsonaro to actually hold on to power, not just hold on to power, but actually bring on more support of the armed forces, support that he cannot call on now, that he does not have the depth of support from the generals and elsewhere to lead the kind of military or armed coup that maybe he would have wanted to lead to hold on to power? So it is true that Brazil's democratic institutions are holding out resilient in the face of Bolsonaro's claims that there's fraud and manipulation and they're trying to steal the vote, a la Trump in 2020. But I think that it's important to consider a counterfactual, where if the pandemic didn't happen, if some of these general crises in the global economy weren't to be so severe as they are now, would we see a position where Bolsonaro could advance with even more power, even more gall, even less shame to attack these basic institutions? And I think that engaging that counterfactual is critical to get to a really realistic assessment of where the institutional infrastructure in this country is at. So I think, all these things have combined to make a deep crisis for Bolsonarismo, a crisis that many of us assumed would have led to a great defeat of all of his candidates. But I think that Pedro's right, that what it did is all these crises basically revealed in the truest colors just how unstable the class bargain of Bolsonarismo really was. Massive accumulation for the top percent, while the total neglect for the bottom. And I think it's out of that desperation that we're seeing a new realignment of class interests in this election.